Welcome to the weekly Strength in Numbers live episode of our podcast. I'm Elliot Morris, your host. I'm here with David Neer, my co-host and lovely friend, and the publisher of the Down Ballot newsletter. We're going to try something new. So just one little explainer here before we get started. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, first, it should be the first episode. Welcome. Please continue to do that. But I'll urge you to join the live taping of our show every Thursday because we do react to your subscriber questions live. And it's just, I think it's a much better way to get the interactive feeling for the podcast. So that's one disclaimer for you. David and I are going to dive into a few different topics, some of which are spicier than others. We're going to address my recent column on anti-system voters, or why I think Democrats can win former Trump voters without necessarily moving to the right. Then we'll break down some new polling on transgender rights, which has stirred up some backlash for the argument. The online, I guess, pro-liberalism magazine, I think is how they describe themselves. That's a sort of redux of the good polling versus bad polling debate for those 538 true fans out there. And stick around till the end. We've got some polling about polling from YouGov. Who actually answers surveys? What's their deal? Are they all a bunch of sickos? That's our lead. And David, hi, welcome. How are you?
Elliot, I'm doing well. And thank you to all of our listeners and viewers for tuning in. And Elliot, don't forget also, we wanted to maybe discuss the DHS funding shutdown.
Yes, let's do that. We'll talk about and this is my article for tomorrow, what I think of as not necessarily just an appropriations fight, but also maybe an electoral fight for the Democrats, reaping some rewards on changing the frames about immigration. So, but let's start with the big meaty piece of the podcast every week. This week, we're doing my column from yesterday on anti-system voters. The key insight here is, and maybe a building block, is that we're used to thinking of politics on the left-right axis, in flatland, as my friend Michael Podhorzer calls it, where you vote for whatever party is closest to you on your left-right axis. I'm trying not to be too boring about this, but this is what's called the median voter theorem in traditional political science. So if you are center-left, you vote for Democrats, and if you're center-right, you vote for Republicans, and there's no nuance in this model. There are lots of ways that this breaks down. First, how do you put people on that flat axis from left to right? Like, what policies matter to them? How are you scaling them? If people don't actually have attitudes, but you're asking them a poll question, maybe they will seem like they have attitudes, and you put them on the line on their median voter theorem, but they don't really belong there. That's a really important problem that I've been trying to flesh out on Strength in Numbers for the last 6 months or so. But in this case, the problem I'm pointing out with the median voter theorem is that there's a bunch of other policy or non-policy related political questions, things about ideology that are not about policy ideology or what you want the government to do, but generally how you feel about the government and your leaders and the economic system in America. This is what is called in the literature, here's my political science hat on for a second, anti-system sentiment or ideology. And in this case, this is measured quadrennially in the American National Elections Study. And this concept comes from four questions that are important. The first is, whether or not you think the government is delivering policy change. There's another question on whether or not the government is serving elites and people. And in general, the idea here is whether or not actually you're pro-government or anti-government. There's a question about the economic system as well. So I think that's why people call it pro or anti-system. So this is what we're talking about. People who say the government isn't delivering for them or that it's wasting money. And my article this week is about a new survey that finds that this anti-system axis in American politics is related to voting for Donald Trump in 2016 and 2024. And that it is predictive of voting for Donald Trump, whatever your left-right ideology is, which is the key insight here. So if you are a liberal in 2020 who is anti-system. This model predicts that you vote for Trump in 2024 because the anti-system axis is activated in 2024. Some numbers here are in 2016, according to the scale, if you scored 0 on the anti-system axis, which maybe we can think of that as being pro-system, or maybe anti-system. I'm not quite sure. Like, it's not necessarily pro-government to say the government isn't wasting money. But anyhow, if you're anti-system, you have a 5% chance of voting for Trump in 2016. And if you're anti-system, you have a 55% higher chance of voting for Trump. And if you're like already sort of a on the fence Democrat, this means you're overwhelmingly likely to vote for Donald Trump just because of the anti-systemness of the political sphere. Um, so this is one of the reasons, and I'll connect this to 2028 now in a second. But one of the reasons in my mind and in the model why Democrats lost in 2024, because there were lots of Democrats that, or people that would have been liberals had there not been this activated anti-system ideology in politics. People that could have voted for an anti-system Democratic candidate, but felt the only anti-system option for them was Donald Trump. And I saw that a lot in my daily life. I've been exposed to lots of young men in particular who were policy liberals, actually Bernie Sanders voting progressives in 2016, and switched to voting for Donald Trump in 2024 because of general like anti-system stuff. David, people who said that that the U.S. was involved in too many foreign forever wars, and they needed to to stop being the U.S. government needs to stop being involved in that and spend more money on stuff like welfare, um, or that there's too much waste in the government and it costs too much to run the government, and sort of Elon Musk type arguments about the way the government functions. They're not necessarily arguments about the government doing less but being more efficient. Anyway, um, so then the argument or the question for people trying to figure out, I think, is the way to frame it, how Democrats can win in 2028 is how do they win votes among the anti-system voters? Like, what type of candidates do they nominate? Um, and for like a very easy archetype here, the person is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders if he's too old and he won't run again. Um, Someone asks, anti-system equals populism. I think that's one general way to think about it. Um, So, in this, so my argument to people is think about what a Democratic Party that is actually competing for people who are frustrated with politics looks like. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's argument is there's lots of parts of the government that don't actually work for working people, and I want to make those actually work. Whereas, for example, J.D. Vance and Donald Trump's argument last year was there are lots of pieces of government machinery that don't work, and we're going to tear them down and replace them with private goods or private services, for example. And this is much more an invitation to people to think about anti-system ideology and how Democrats can activate it than an endorsement of any individual candidate. I'll just say that. Um, and I think it's just a potentially really powerful question for Democrats to ask themselves here. If they're going to pick a anti-system candidate, or to use the parlance of the left, a non-corporatist, like who are they going to pick to satisfy those people who would use that sort of language to describe politics today?
So,
Okay, that's the article.
Elliot, we had a really interesting question from Elemental who asked, what percentage of liberals are anti-system? And I think maybe that's a broader question in my mind of to what degree does system versus anti-system maybe even override the traditional left-right policy axis? Because obviously you have a lot of lefty anti-system folks who are very pissed about the way things have been going for the last however many years, and they still loyally show up to vote for Democrats, including at the presidential level. But for a certain portion of the population, this anti-system sentiment, like those Bernie to Trump voters you were talking about, overrides those more traditional political leanings.
Yeah, the direct answer to this question is most of them. So the survey is the 4 questions that are asked that are anti-system in the American National Election Study. The average person answers yes to 3 of those questions. So they score, 75% or so anti-system. Actually, most of us are anti-system in some way, which I think makes sense given like how upset people are with the cost of living and the perception of the government's not solving their problems. Again, I guess the perception of that. Um, so most people, regardless of where you are on the ideological spectrum, are anti-sentiment or anti-system. So if you activate that sentiment among them, regardless of where they are, in this case, in the middle, or even a conservative, uh, that is, the research finds that gives you a lever to pull on to invite those people into your party. And this is what Donald Trump does in 2016. He doesn't he does not win. Donald Trump does not win the 2016 election by being a moderate, right? He's far to the right of Mitt Romney on most policy questions. There are a couple of policy signals Donald Trump sends, but they actually show he's anti-system, right? So he's like pro-trade, he's anti-labor, he's anti-corporate neoliberal globalism. That's the signal he's sending by endorsing tariffs. Or of course, there's the constant beating of the drum against the media elites in general and banking system, which we know that's a dog whistle for. That's also typically interpreted as being an anti-system sentiment as well among people. So yes, there are more anti-system people than there are conservatives or liberals. Figuring out how to change your political party to allow those people to vote for you is a really high leverage way to win an election.
Is it possible to graph this on a, full Cartesian plane of like liberal versus conservative and then system versus anti-system? And, what do the four boxes look like? Are there kind of any empty boxes?
Well, the research says it's the people are scattered all over the place, that these aren't related to each other at all. That being more liberal or being more conservative does not make you more anti-system or pro-system. The language here in political science is that they are orthogonal. They're completely uncorrelated. So there's just as many anti-system Democrats as there are anti-system Republicans, on average over the last decade or so. So if you put those people on a plot like this, it would just be a circle. It would just be a smattering all over the place. Uh, that's a great question. I will say 2 things. First, an image like that is in my article. But second, Substack tells us that they will allow us to live stream our computer screen soon, in which case we can show plots
Oh
live on
yeah.
the call, which would be a big help here in showing this graphically. So
So
something to look forward to.
we're getting a lot of really good questions. This is almost feeling like a really cool political science class. And
Oh no.
Nancy asked to define what system or anti-system is. Definitely check out Elliot's article on strength in numbers at gelliottmorris.com, 2 L's, 2 T's. And that very clearly explains these four questions that this survey used to determine system versus anti-system bias that Elliot just ran through briefly earlier. So David Solomon asks, I'm going to reference these two questions at the same time just so we don't lose track of them. David Solomon asks, who do you lose if you pick someone like AOC? And you allude to this very briefly in your article. And then Jack Santucci asks, do you think that mainstream political science has been resistant to this kind of analysis, the system versus anti-system analysis?
Jack would know better than me. Jack should write about that. There, I think I'm just trying to invite people to actually answer this question empirically. There is an assumption that by moving to the left, by picking someone like AOC, you gain nobody. You only marginalize the moderates and you automatically lose an election. That is wrong if you view politics in this two-dimensional left-right versus pro-anti-system axis that is historically better predictive of voting behavior, again, according to the research cited in the article. So this is much more an invitation for people to actually do that math in the next election cycle. How many people are being lost? How many people are being gained by nominating an anti-system, but maybe more progressive candidate like an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? Um, and this reminds me of a lot of the debate people were having about Zohran Mamdani before the 2025 New York City primary election, right? They were saying he's too progressive to win New York City, which is somewhat laughable assumption on its face, but that he would lose in the general election because a more moderate candidate, Andrew Cuomo, would sweep the moderate lane. And he'd be dividing the Democratic Party among leftists and centrists. Again, it's New York City, so it seems like a silly assumption to make that Cuomo would have won. But the thing they're missing is the anti-systemness of it all. Zohran Mamdani's message was that like the current government is not helping you afford to live, in so many words, and we're going to change the system so that we help you. That is an anti-system message. Now, when he runs again, that's the big question. When he runs again, is he now pro-system, the system that he built? And this is the question Donald Trump and JD Vance have to answer for 2028. Are they now the system, the establishment, the incumbents, and can they run against the anti? Can they run the same anti-system campaign? In 2020, the answer was no. Donald Trump lost. He did not win anti-system voters in 2020. So again, there's opportunity here for Democrats to build that sort of coalition that they have historically had that said, we're going to like fight to change the system to help working class, middle class people. Great questions.
That reminds me of one of my favorite scenes in a movie that I really love. Oh, brother, where art thou? Elliot, have you seen this one?
You mean the Odyssey? Yeah, of course.
Yes, and one of the backdrops or the narratives in this story is that the governor of Mississippi is running for re-election, and he faces very dire odds because people are sick of his administration, and his opponent keeps talking about reform, reform, reform. And one of his advisors, his dumb advisor, says, "Well, we should run on reform, Daddy." And he says, "How are we going to run on reform? We the damn incumbent." And
He
I think
knows.
that it's a very poignant problem, and I think it gets to why it feels like, in particular in recent decades, that U.S. politics has had these dramatic swings between the Democrats and Republicans because there just always seems to be this throw the bumps out sentiment.
David, can I tell you my favorite line from that movie since you brought it up?
Please.
Uh, it, I can't remember the circumstances. I'm sorry. I believe the names, one of the actors is off screen and lost. And let's just call him more stupid one, looks under a cup and finds a toad and screams, "They turned Delmar into a toad."
Yes,
Best line. It's the best part. It's the best part
it's a
ever.
great movie.
There are, and just I guess by wrapping up, let's say there are a lot of live tests of this idea in politics right now. If you view it in this way, the potentially Talrico or Crockett versus whoever it is going to be on the Republican side election in Texas is an anti-system versus pro-system contest. Talrico is running this, in my opinion, great line over and over again, where he says the right is drawing attention on the wrong 1%. They want you to be upset about the immigrants, this is a bad paraphrasing. This is why I'm not a politician. The immigrants, transgender people, other minorities, and this is the wrong 1%. The 1% you should be worried about is the people in power with all the money, the system. So that is also can be interpreted as an anti-system message, and we'll see how much success Democrats have if they stick with that message in Texas. See if they can pull over any moderates or conservatives with the anti-systemness of it all.
And I think it's really been crystallized by the Epstein files in particular, because there's this term that gained currency very, very quickly. In particular, just a few weeks ago, I saw John Ossoff using it at a rally that he did, talking about the Epstein class. And I think it's a brilliant shorthand for describing these ultra powerful, ultra rich people who also seem to have total legal impunity. And we just saw such remarkable examples of that today across the world. I mean, so many people have been commenting about this, about how, the former Prince Andrew in the UK getting arrested, and the former leaders in South Korea and Brazil also facing long sentences. And here in the US, the Epstein class walks away without even a slap on the wrist. So I think that it definitely has the potential to be extremely, extremely powerful. And one thing I also wanted to tie it into and ask you about, Elliot, is we've seen this other axis that may even be the same axis that gets talked about a lot in political context since 2025 about fight versus don't fight. And that you have a lot of Democratic candidates and politicians who want to take a more robust stance against Donald Trump and his abuses of power and creeping fascism in this country, and others who are hewing to the more traditional keep your powder dry mold. Oh, we can't win, so don't even try. And I feel like we've seen a lot of those fights stop breaking down along traditional left-right lines. The person who comes to mind the most of all is Connor Lamb, the former congressman from Pennsylvania who lost the Senate primary to John Fetterman in 2022. And sometime last year, AOC said, I owe a big apology to Connor Lamb because, of course, John Fetterman, has completely, gone off the deep end. And Connor Lamb, this moderate, suburban veteran candidate. Here he is saying, no, we have to fight these guys tooth and nail. And so that to me feels like maybe a recasting or recapitulation of the system versus anti system framework.
Yeah, I know we should move on, but I'll just say one more thing. I'm looking for better ways, and so I'm inviting audience feedback here of asking this fight versus compromise question pollsters are always asking. I just think there's a better way to get at this because I don't actually think that's the tension, right? Like who's going to say they don't want a politician to fight for their goals, right? I don't think that's um, the right operationalization here. I've talked to some pollsters and I think some of them have some ideas, but none of them are really moving me yet. So I think it will require some experimentations. If you have ideas, I guess just reach out.
But I think that's just it, Elliot. The fact that you can't conceive of a question to say
Yeah, it's a
embody
vibe.
futurism,
Yeah.
like shows how unpopular that approach is. Well,
Well,
you
Chuck
said you
Schumer is the least popular politician in America, so that's low hanging fruit there. Yeah. Speaking of senators,
yes.
here's the forced segue. I was listening to the Daily today. Thank you. One of my um, just wait until I do it with sponsors. One of my only news intakes on my daily walk with my dog. And I heard Senator Catherine Cortez Masto cite some polling data in this conversation about the ICE shutdown, in which she says, the public is behind, that the public is behind the Democrats on the mask requirement that they're asking for, on the body cam mandate, which again, there's some debate about whether or not that's already mandated. Indeed, with the masking as well. There's polling showing Americans want judicial warrants for any sort of entry into a home, for example. And it's a it's a good episode in which Catherine Cortez Masto says, like, they are shutting down the government because these things are popular. So, point one for polls there, just by the way. Um, but I wanted to revisit our understanding of the current DHS and ICE fight based on that conversation. Um, I know you have some thoughts here as well, but my big thing is in tying this into the September shutdown as well over healthcare. I think people should view these less as like actual fights over appropriations and more as signals to the public about what's valuable to them. Catherine Cortez Masto says this explicitly in her daily episode, and she says in the September shutdown debate, there was no expectation that Democrats were actually going to force Republicans to capitulate on ACA subsidies and actually reinstate ACA subsidies to lower price of healthcare premiums. But they did it anyway because they wanted to seem like the party that was fighting for healthcare subsidies. They wanted to be the party that kept issue ownership over subsidies so they could run on them in future elections. And they very easily point out that Republicans voted to repeal those. And we, maybe to your point, fought for them. Uh, she draws the same parallel to the current shutdown fight, which is somewhat weird to me because the fight is ongoing. You don't necessarily want to like shoot your leverage in the foot, but but as an argument to say this shutdown fight is as much about sending the signal to voters that they're going to fight against excessive immigration, prosecution of immigration deportations, and just the immigration deportation agenda in general, so that they can run on, you know, reinstating masks for anti-mask policy for law enforcement requiring judicial warrants. body cameras, etc. Um, and I wrote a couple of weeks ago to tie this together about the utility of exactly this strategy, and I'll write about this again for tomorrow. Um, there's this assumption that Republicans have an issue advantage on immigration, that the American people trust Republicans more on immigration, or whatever surveys you want to pick apart to make this case. And my argument and your argument since I think last April, David, has been if Democrats can just get the American people to think of immigration not as border security, but as deportations of people who have lived here for 20 years, that the popularity of the issue, the Republican advantage on the issue, would slip away. So I think Catherine Cortez Masto is coming at this at a very similar angle. The more Democrats can signal that immigrations equals mass deportations and mass people in the street, in their mind, the better. So I'm not actually sure if they'll get any of the concessions they want. I'm sure they'll get some, but they will definitely have a tool to run on in the midterms, regardless of what reforms get passed.
I
What are
think
you
this
thinking about here?
I think this shutdown is so different from the last one in so many ways, and I want to address some of those. But the fact that it's Cortez Masto, of all people, taking this stance really, really stands out to me. She is very centrist, very moderate. And in particular, during the last shutdown, she was one of just three members of the Democratic Senate caucus who voted for the GOP funding bill to reopen the government every single time from day one. It was just her, Angus King of Maine, and John Fetterman from Pennsylvania. And Cortez Masto, she's from very swingy Nevada, which of course Trump flipped in 2024, and super cautious about her political future. And to your point, Elliot, about the nuances, we've talked about this a lot before, but it's really worth emphasizing that Cortez Masto is hinging her arguments on this, that she is going beyond the top line polling of just how do you feel about Donald Trump on immigration and looking at these more nuanced questions. And if there's just one thing more than any other that I would beg both pollsters and polling analysts and just ordinary folks to engage with, is these more nuanced questions about things like how do you feel about deporting people who have lived here for 20 years and are productive members of their community and have never committed a crime? How do you feel about law enforcement officials wearing masks as they patrol the streets of American cities? And when you drill down into these questions, then someone like a Cortez Masto, who really in a lot of ways embodies Schumerism, even she wants to stand stronger here. The day that Alex Preddy was murdered last month in Minneapolis, she immediately came out with a statement saying, we cannot support this DHS funding bill. And so did basically the entire Democratic caucus, except for Fetterman once again. And Democrats are much more united this time around. That's my perception. And I alluded to this earlier, but this is what's so different about this shutdown. The Congress already passed funding bills for almost every other branch of government. It's really just DHS now that is going unfunded. And that DHS only accounts for around 4% of the total federal spending. Of course, that's still a very large number, but you're not seeing or feeling anywhere near the kind of pain that you did with the last government shutdown, in which so many more people were affected, both government workers and obviously everyone who interacts with the government. So let's look at this specifically. The main agencies affected by this shutdown are TSA, FEMA, the Coast Guard and Secret Service, ICE, and Customs and Border Protection. But FEMA, as horrible as this is, FEMA is almost already shut down because Trump has regularly rejected requests for disaster aid. And I find that absolutely astonishing that, you know, on the long list of things that should be infinitely bigger scandals that aren't, to me, FEMA really stands out because we often say, oh, imagine if a Democrat were doing X, imagine the reaction. But with FEMA, we know exactly what it's like when a Republican fails on the FEMA front with George
Yep.
Bush because it helped bring down his presidency. So the fact that that hasn't gained traction is amazing to me. But again, shutting down FEMA has a much smaller impact than you would think because Trump's already basically shut it down. ICE, meanwhile, has this obscene slush fund that it won from Congress last year. Its budget had been around $10 billion a year. It got bumped up to $85 billion a year. So it's not running out of money anytime soon. That really leaves TSA as like the main public facing government agency where folks who work for that agency are going without pay right now. And that's a huge problem and can always lead to serious pain when people start to call out sick who work at airports. Pain for them, obviously, pain for travelers. But I want to point out that this time, air traffic controllers are not affected by this shutdown. So
Mm.
this shutdown is really, really narrow. And to me, it suggests that it could go on for an extremely long time. I mean, the fall shutdown already broke records, but this one could go on for months and months.
Yeah, because of how small it is and the perceived impacts of it. On
Yep.
that note, there are proposals uh, to curb some of the harm. The Democrat, I forget her name, the head of appropriations in the House, um,
Is that
pitched
Deloro?
Deloro, thank you, pitched a bill that would fund FEMA and the Coast Guard and the TSA while ICE and CBP remained shut down while the ICE negotiations were ongoing. And Republicans said no because they didn't want to lose their leverage in the entire
Right.
shutdown, which makes sense. But this is another way to think of like how can you force the other side into a public display of their position on an issue. In this case, the Republican position being we're like not going to compromise on the ICE issue, uh, even if that means that the TSA that travel for spring break is delayed, or Coast Guard resources are getting pulled, or there's no emergency management. Um, you can make that argument against either side in a shutdown, but the leverage that any side receives is all about forcing the other side to look bad. So there are some ways out of the problem.
Have we seen any polling on this particular shutdown? Because during the last shutdown, the polls universally showed that voters were blaming Republicans much more than they were blaming Democrats, which always happens with every shutdown. And even though frankly, Republicans and much of the media as well tried their best to pin the blame on Democrats, I have this belief that that's just a hard thing to do because everyone knows that Democrats are the party of government, the party that believes in government, that at least wants government to work. And in the same way that, at least until very recently, Republicans were always, the party of the pro-gun party, trying to accuse Republicans, frankly, until the ICE raids in the Twin Cities of being anti-gun. That was never really going to stick. So accusing Democrats of being anti-government and wanting to shut down the government, I just think that's super hard to stick. So have we seen any data on this yet?
There was one survey I covered from Data for Progress that showed voters support the compromise I just mentioned from Deloro, and there was another poll from Hart Research, I think published by the Senate Majority PAC. Yeah, here it is. It's just asking. Yes, 5440 voters favor shutting down the government, blocking DHS funding until ICE reform debate is resolved. So there you go.
Yeah, I think that's going to buoy Democrats as
Or
well.
54 to 36, excuse me. Yeah.
Mm.
So yeah, that's another, and that's not surprising, right? The shutdowns typically resolve poorly for the party in power. They're the one that gets blamed, especially by those low information voters we're always talking about, people who aren't paying super close attention to who's doing what on Capitol Hill. I mean, it's just easy to see government shutdown equal Trump and Republicans' fault. And then I bet if we did a poll that that's what we would find.
You should do it on the next Verisite poll. When is that coming out?
It's coming out next week, but unfortunately, we finalized the survey
You
before the
locked the
shutdown existed.
questionnaire?
Yeah, we locked.
Ooh, open
Yeah,
it.
this is the second time we've done this, so I think we'll reconsider how we do the questionnaire for the next one, just to be a little more timely.
All right. Well, to all the other pollsters who are listening in on this live stream,
Please send
ask
us your
about the
numbers.
shutdown. Please send us numbers. Yep, right now. Drop it in the chat box.
Yeah, put them on. David, I know you wanted to talk about this survey from The Argument, which has had a lot of negative coverage, especially on Twitter over the last couple of days. I wonder if you saw more about this than I did. Do you want to start us off here?
Yeah, the argument is this new site that is created by a bunch of folks, I think, associated with the abundance movement in particular, and includes folks like Matt Iglesias and Laksha Jain. And the piece
And
generated.
it was started by Jerusalem Dimzas, who used to write for The Atlantic as well.
Right. And we'll mention her some more in a moment, but the piece that generated all the attention was by Laksha Jain, and it was titled "The Trans Rights Backlash is Real." And it to me that felt like an extremely trolly headline because in this social media world, most people don't click on the links. People are going to react to the headline, maybe the subhead, maybe the author, and maybe the publication. That's going to be much of your response. And so when you title something like that, you're guaranteed to spark a backlash to your title about this supposed backlash. And what really bothered me about this was that Jerusalem Demsas then had to post kind of an apologia the next day, I think.
That's what I would call it too. Yeah.
And I want to be clear that term, I had to look it up to make sure I was using it right. An apologia is not an apology. An apologia is basically a long-winded defense, and I think it's usually used a little bit derisively by nerds in modern times. And so
Certainly you meant it that way, didn't you?
I absolutely did, because you publish a piece touting this polling about this supposed trans rights backlash, and then the very next day you're kind of doing cleanup on aisle three, and doing this long-winded defense of why you actually published this. And her piece was kind of scattered and all over the place. But what really bothered me most about it was she said something, and I'm
But
condensing,
I'm
but this
sorry,
is
can I interrupt you just before we
yes,
get there and like read the
please.
questions for people who
Oh,
haven't seen
yes, yes,
them?
yes. No, you go
Um,
right ahead.
okay. um, uh, the questions here, I think, are important because the title of the article is "The Trans Rights Backlash is Real." But the questions are about some very specific proposals. First, it's whether or not voters support a law that would require transgender people to use the bathroom, the public bathroom corresponding with their birth sex, which maybe we can call a transgender right. Importantly, the public is on board with this. 39% strongly support, 13% somewhat support, versus a total of 33% who oppose. So if that's your right that you're talking about, then where's the backlash? Well, they find the backlash by asking for some very specific policies that have animated political discourse, especially on the right recently. The big one being whether or not the government should require transgender K through 12 athletes to compete with other competitors uh, assigned to the same birth sex by category. Um, and that is popular. So that requirement that transgender athletes compete in the same sports group as people of their birth sex is technically popular. But the other questions here about rights are not nearly as in the camp of what you might expect in a like right to be trans questionnaire. There are some questions about surgery, gender surgery reassignment for minors, which again is like the most unpopular component of trans rights you could pick to poll to then make your argument. So I would encourage people to go look at the questions. It's a very specific set of questions that are being called trans rights here. I didn't mean to interrupt you too much, but just some table setting there.
Yeah, and as always important to emphasize with that last question in particular, gender affirming surgery for minors is something that virtually never happens, and so it's a classic bugaboo that's used to scare people about something that is just extremely extremely rare if it happens at all. And that's I'm glad you brought up the specific questions because the way Dempsey framed this in her apologia was she said, people are rightly worried that bad politicians might misuse polling data. But she said the solution to what bad politicians do with polls isn't to suppress the data, but to actually read it. And I thought that was so irresponsible because this data doesn't just exist in the ether. Someone chooses to spend money polling these questions and drafts these questions in a particular way. There is no perfectly neutral set of data that encapsulates exactly how Americans feel about trans rights, and that we should all, look to this gospel and, sit around and have giant symposiums about it. This was a deliberate choice. And then I also feel like she was just washing her hands of the whole problem, because what happens when these bad politicians don't actually read the data or engage with it properly? You can never expect politicians to do that. They don't have the time and they don't have the inclination.
Right. Can I just say, as someone who literally has a publication about numbers, people read headlines and they don't. I'm sorry, but this should just have been obvious to someone who's been working in media for over a decade, especially somewhere like The Atlantic, where headlines get taken out of context all the time. Rage
Yeah.
bait for clicks is classic, is a classic way to get traffic there. And to get so upset at people calling you out for the headline and not reading the story should have just seemed obvious.
Yeah.
We were having this conversation, this classic cliche on Twitter in 2015 to say, "Oh, read the article." And we know over a decade of experience on social media as journalists that people will just respond to the headline. So to not anticipate that the headline of the piece would have been important in framing the way people digested the piece seems like a pretty thoughtless approach to the coverage of the polling here. It's also it also just disagrees with the original article. I mean, the full thrust of the original article was that trans rights are unpopular, Democrats aren't saving it, and the implication being they need to distance themselves from trans rights. So I think you're right to label the response from Dems as apologia. Um, and in some ways, it throws the pollster under the bus
Yeah.
for what probably should have been correctly identified early on as like either too much punditry based on the data that was going to get them in trouble, or an argumentative position for a capital L liberal approach to social policy here that you would want to defend. I guess like pick your lane about whatever that's going to be, but stick in it. Instead, there's like a lot of throwing the pollster under the bus to save face based off of the public reaction here. It seems bad. It seems thoughtless, to use her word of her headline.
So I want to step back a bit here as well, which is that there's another real deep problem with polling these issues or treating these issues as though they exist in a vacuum. And Josh Marshall of Talking Points Memo, he wrote a piece last year, and I'm going to drop a link into the chat. I highly recommend reading it. It has stuck with me ever since. And what he pointed out, he said, if Republicans can successfully make the argument that Democrats don't care about the cost of living challenges facing the majority of Americans because they're hyper focused on trans issues, that's a big problem. And I think that really, really nails it, because there's the infamous Trump they them ad from 2024, which seemed to scar an entire generation of Democratic politicians and consultants. And they interpreted that ad as saying trans rights are unpopular, therefore we should throw trans people under the bus. That is essentially the Matt Iglesias argument. But Josh Marshall shows that that wasn't it at all. Trump successfully weaponized trans rights to suggest to voters that Democrats were concerned about trans rights to the exclusion of actually caring about ordinary people and the very serious issues of the crisis of affordability that we face. And this can be so easily turned against Republicans, because I'll give you an example that I absolutely love and doesn't get nearly the attention that it should, though the Washington Post actually referenced it in a piece just this week. Last year, Democrats won the mayor's race in Omaha, a city that had been Republican for more than a decade. And John Ewing was the Democratic candidate, and he was attacked as per usual as, caring about they, them and trans rights. And he doesn't care about, girls being able to safely play girls' sports. And the Nebraska Democrats, they just had this one tweet with this amazing image. And Gene Strother was the Republican incumbent. And this image that they tweeted out, I don't even think it got into mailers, but it sums up John Ewing's own argument. Gene is focused on potties and John is focused on fixing potholes. And it had this very cheap looking Photoshop of Gene Strother's face ducking under a stall in a public restroom. And boom, that's exactly it. This is
Yeah.
how you shove it back in their faces. You say, you think that Democrats are care too much about trans people to the exclusion of things like affordability. Well, how about Republicans wanting to spy on kids' genitals? Do they care about fixing potholes and all of the issues that affect day-to-day life? And so to act as though trans rights exist in this pure vacuum that the broader politics doesn't all inform how we talk about that and how we treat that issue is so naive and really small-minded.
Yeah, I mean, just two things. Speaking of
Please.
naive, right? I mean, this survey, and I just found the conclusion of the piece to back up what I was saying earlier from Laksha Jain. The end of the piece reads, oh, here it is. Here we go. Given that the midterms tend to be a referendum on the party in power, it's fair to say that Democrats are well positioned to make serious gains. I'm omitting some clauses here, but that is very different from whether the public agrees with progressives on the topic of transgender rights. And it is clear that the opinion landscape on trans issues has become sharply unfavorable to the progressive viewpoints. And he says persuasion is possible, but if they want to convince the country, Democrats should start with their own base. So I just don't see how the reading of this piece is any different than the one implied by the headline in actuality. And let me just tie into that thing I said about the naivete. This survey does not ask at all about discrimination in housing or hiring, which is something that transgender Americans are really focused on right now when they're talking about rights. That's one of the big things they're talking about. And in the defense of Laksha Jain that Jerusalem dims its rights, she cites a lot of this other polling that shows, voters actually do care about the rights and the anti-discrimination proposals from the Democrats, so it's not so black and white. But in fact, the polling that you presented was very black and white and used to make the case that people should be
Yeah.
thrown under the bus. So I think there's a naivete or just a lack of thought about what should have been asked in the survey. That's why I said at the beginning of this that we could probably label it a bad use of polling as well. But I wanted to pick up on something you said just finally on this from me. There is data that the Democratic strategy here is working. As you note, that candidate for mayor won his race in the Virginia governor's race. Abigail Spanberger also won on basically a reframe away from getting bogged down in the argument about transports and instead leaving that issue to local lawmakers and then running the rest of her campaign on like affordability and acceptance and anti-ICE deployments in her state. And in terms of another data point here, Fox asked voters, I think last month in a January 2026 poll, who do you trust more to handle the issue of transgender rights or transgender issues, which is itself a weird question. And voters say they trust Democrats to handle the issue more by 22 points. So whatever you think here about the merits of various cases, like, there is not an empirical argument that you can make right now that transgender rights as a big umbrella issue like are favoring Republicans and Democrats just shy away from it. Yeah, maybe they should say, as Abigail Spanberger did, oh, there's a bunch of gotcha questions here about transgender women playing in men's sports, but those are gotcha questions, and let's talk about potholes. And that seems to be an entirely consistent case that, or entirely consistent with the case that like transgender people in America deserve non-discrimination laws. So uh, that's I think what I think on this one.
I, in theory, have a lot more to say about this. I do have a lot more to say about this, but I'm gonna let us wrap up here since we are already a few minutes over time. We had over 500 people tuning in. Absolutely awesome. Our biggest audience yet. If you are listening to this as a podcast, as a recording after the fact, you can tune in live at 2 p.m. Eastern every Thursday when the Strength in Numbers podcast goes up on Substack Live. You can download the free Substack app. Great way to tune in. You can also watch, I believe, on desktop now. I am recording this from or streaming this from desktop, so that is a new option. And then there's apparently Substack TV.
If you're watching this on a
If you're
TV,
watching on
please
Substack
let us
TV,
know.
definitely let us
Let
know.
us know. Thank you so much for co-hosting today, David. It was a pleasure.
Always.
And thanks for the audience.
See you next week, everybody.